right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Ben Domenech Podcast, brought to you by Fox News. You can subscribe to all the Fox News podcasts at foxnewspodcast.com. I hope that you will rate and review this one, as well as subscribe to it and recommend it to your friends, because frankly, we're a new show and we're trying to grow the audience. Today, I have an interview with someone who is at the center of the conversation about sex and gender in America. Abigail Shrier is an author, attorney, and journalist. She has degrees from Columbia, Oxford, and Yale. She's also the author of Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze, Seducing Our Daughters, which was one of the best books of 2020 by The Economist. Shrier is a bold voice on these issues, and she's had to deal with the consequences of taking a prominent and controversial position, something that wasn't controversial until what it seems like was 5 minutes ago. She wrote in the Wall Street Journal back in June of last year about the struggles that she experienced in advocating for her book, writing, "If you write a book celebrating troubled teenage girls suddenly coming out as transgender in friend groups, pursuing a regimen of cross-sex hormones and surgeries, Amazon will happily promote it. But if you write a book that points out the risks of this gender journey, Amazon wants nothing to do with you. This is the lesson my publisher, Regnery, learned last week when Amazon informed it that Regnery wouldn't be permitted to run a sponsored ad for my book, Irreversible Damage. Amazon's stated reason for barring the ad, a simple picture of my book's cover, was this: it contains elements that may not be appropriate for all audiences, which may include ad copybook content that infers or claims to diagnose, treat, or question sexual orientation. In fact," she writes, "the book has nothing to do with sexual orientation." Building on the work of Brown University public health researcher Lisa Littman, Irreversible Damage argues that transgender identification among teen girls has become a social contagion. Girls who might have encouraged each other in bulimia, anorexia, or cutting are today deciding they have gender dysphoria, pushing for hormones and surgeries, and easily obtaining them. The numbers are startling. In the nearly 100-year diagnostic history of gender dysphoria, severe discomfort in one's biological sex, the disorder first appeared in early childhood, ages 2 to 4, and overwhelmingly afflicted boys. Today, teen girls with no history of childhood dysphoria are suddenly the leading demographic. From 2016 to 2017, the number of gender surgeries on girls and women in the U.S. quadrupled, with biological females accounting for 70% of all gender surgeries. Part of the reason this has become an epidemic among teen girls, she writes, is that unlike bulimia or anorexia, our culture celebrates girls who medically transition and denigrates or cancels all who point out that this can be a mode of self-harm. Abigail Shrier testified this past week in front of the U.S. Congress about the Equality Act, something that would enshrine in law many different things that are raising questions across this spectrum of policy. She said, in part, if S-393, that's the Equality Act, merely proposed to extend employment and public housing rights to gay and transgender Americans, I would be supporting this bill instead of testifying against it. I'm here today because the bill does much more, and no one who wrote it appears to have thoughtfully considered what it would mean for women and girls. The legislation, as Shrier says it, has nothing to do with transgender people and everything to do with opportunistic self-identification by violent male felons who will take advantage of instances such as when the Washington Correctional Center for Women allowed prisoners to live in certain facilities based on their gender identities, resulting in the rape of at least one female. If you pass this bill, she warned, you can expect hundreds more victims like this one. I have probably interviewed more transgender Americans than any person in this room, she said, and I can honestly say that excepting political activists, most do not want to obliterate women's rights and safe spaces. Most would never think of stealing women's scholarships by forcing young women into demoralizing contests with male bodies. But gender ideology, which is at the heart of this bill, is misogyny in progressive clothing. Gender ideology tells women and girls that they are not entitled to their fear or their sense of unfairness as their protective spaces are eliminated. Abigail Shrier is at the center of this discussion, which is one of the most controversial culture war elements of our moment. It was a pleasure to talk to her. Coming up, we'll hear from our guest, Abigail Shrier. Abigail Shrier, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to ask you about a number of different issues that are obviously at the center of American life at the moment. Some issues that really, rile people up, that are controversial, that are, frankly, batted around and used to both cancel people and to really alter a lot of different American institutions. But before I ask you about those, I just want to ask you about your own willingness to engage on these issues. This is something that clearly is an area where engaging really leads to backlash. Did you have to wrestle with the idea of talking about all of these different subjects, knowing that the consequences for even just expressing your viewpoint, even if it's widely held, could be really negative for you and for those that you care about?
I mean, yes, everyone sort of has to wrestle with it a little bit. It's funny. I've always been kind of a truth teller, which I don't know how to explain that, except that it's kind of my personality and it gets me into all kinds of trouble socially. Things that, if I was the kid in high school, all my girlfriends would be like, you can't say that, and I wouldn't know which thing I had said that they had provoked that response. But so I've always kind of had that personality. Does that mean that I don't enjoy being provocative? I certainly don't seek that out, but I'm interested in things. I'm interested in American life and American culture and where we're going. And I was really interested when a reader wrote to me about what her daughter was going through and had suddenly identified as transgender with her friends and how it ripped her family apart and how her daughter wasn't doing well. At first I tried to pass it on to someone and no one would take it up. And, it's one of those things that I was interested. I mean, I'm not squeamish about it. I was just curious and it didn't affect me personally. So, there are certain issues that I think, affect me more personally and I can't be detached about them. And I don't really enjoy writing about those things, but the things that I can be more detached about, I enjoy writing about because I think I can sort of bring something to the topic without getting too caught up in it. So I guess that's how I ended up here.
I know a lot of people who are close to or have their own children going through experiences right now where they feel pressure to define themselves at a very early age. And what that really looks like, and a lot of times, is that tomboyish girls are being forced into making a decision about whether they're trans or not, often at very, very early ages. I know that that's concerning not just to people who share my own political views, but to people who are on the left. I'm curious how many people have reached out to you as you've been writing and speaking openly about these issues and expressed concern about that type of thing in their life.
Right. So most of the people who reach out to me are politically liberal. They watched their kids go through it and they were sort of the most sure that this was wrong because they sort of looked inside themselves and they've said, listen, I've supported gay marriage forever and way before it was illegal. And I know I'm an ally. I went to every pride parade, but this doesn't seem right for my daughter. So I know I'm not a bigot. But I also think they had the hardest time with it because they really identify being liberal with being a good person. Mm-hmm. And they tell me they're politically homeless now. They always use that term. I'm politically homeless. I don't feel like my party has any idea what it's doing or whatever. And on this issue. And I think it's really disorienting for a lot of them because they feel like I know I'm a good person. I'm supposed to be a Democrat, but nobody in the Democratic Party wants to talk about this or has any sympathy for what I've been going through. This has ripped my family apart. And remember that, like, if your kid comes out as gay, there's no irreversible harm that occurs. But your kid comes out as trans, and the first pressure is, when do I transition? When do I get filled with these hormones that nobody knows the long-term effects of? When do I remove my breasts? Mm-hmm. It's really scary if you care about your kid, and most people do.
Why is it that the established order of conversation around this is so incapable of talking openly about the fact that the ramifications of the kinds of treatment you're talking about have life-changing elements to them, things that can't be reversed with current technology, and that could, ultimately render someone sterile or render them incapable of having children in the future. The kind of decisions that I think most people would give pause to being made at very young ages. And
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.